Gunjan has 25 years of global sourcing, engineering, and marketing experience. He has held senior positions in technology sales and marketing and has managed teams sourcing products and services from China, India, Japan, and the rest of Asia. He began his career as an engineer for Larsen & Toubro, Bangalore, a prominent Indian industrial firm, and came to the U.S. and later worked as Director of Program Management for Tandon Computers. He is the founder and managing director of Amritt Incorporated. Based in California, Gunjan is the author of the acclaimed title, Doing Business in 21st Century India, How to Profit Today from Tomorrow's Most Exciting Market. He has also created an executive seminar, Business with India, for Caltech, the California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California, and taught executives at Thunderbird School of Management, Phoenix. These books and seminars are a direct result of his work as an Indian business consultant for major Western clients. Gunjan has been interviewed on various television shows such as Fox Business TV, BBC World News, The Hub, and so on. He has been quoted extensively in the New York Times, Financial Times, LA Times, among many other newspapers. He also has published articles in the Harvard Business Review, Business Week, CIO Magazine, Purchasing Magazine, Business World, Daily Variety, and many other publications. Without further ado, I would like to now hand over to Gunjan Bagla for the presentation.
Thank you, Supriya, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of those who have joined in on this webinar. We appreciate you making the time on this beautiful spring day to be with us. I'm going to get right into the material, and you should all have the slides before you. And as Supriya said, please keep sending me questions because I like to make this as interactive as possible. Now, this month is one of the most momentous months of the year for India because we are seeing over a 6-week period the world's largest election ever held. India is a democracy for the last 60 years, and it has over 800 million registered voters. That's more voters than all of Western Europe, the United States, and Canada put together. In fact, the number of new voters in this election exceeds the population of Turkey or the Philippines. And to run this election, they need 11 million people working across the country over the 6-week period. The election is completely electronic. You see the picture at the bottom left of the voting machine that they've designed. And every voter carries an ID. You see that in this picture. National IDs are not controversial in India whatsoever. And we will see the results of the election announced on May 16th. Until then, the voting is kept secret and stored in these voting machines across the country. This is a phenomenon that you will not see in the other large economy in Asia that we keep hearing about, being China. Now, before I get further, I want to find out a little bit about you. So I'd like to, if I can, run my very first poll and ask you how much time you've spent in India. If you can take a moment to answer this question. So you should see the results on your screen, and it seems like a good chunk of you have spent more than 30 days in India, and the next highest percentage are people who have spent no time in India at all. And I will try and gear my comments to try and meet the needs of both of these very diverse groups. We also have a few people calling in from India, and that's fine. You're welcome as well. This webinar is geared primarily for people selling internationally into India. So I assume the people calling in from India are working for foreign companies. I want to start with one example of a company we worked with some time ago. It's a mid-sized company broadly related to the electrical business. They don't produce energy, but they produce components that go into the energy business. And they wanted to enter the India market very quietly through an acquisition if possible. They wanted to move very quickly because some of their much larger competitors already had a lead in India. And so they hired us to not only study the market, but to find entities that they might acquire or otherwise invest in. During the process, we looked at well over 5 dozen companies, and our first round of filtration produced about a dozen that were worthwhile to pursue. But through our professional networks, we also found a couple of foreign companies that had gone into India and weren't quite happy with the results or had had a change of strategy in one case. And so they offered us their units, their India business units for sale. And so we finally set up a program for our client to have face-to-face conversations with 4 of the entities. 2 of these were the foreign subsidiaries and 2 Indian companies. We accompanied them on the trip. We sat in on all of the meetings and advised them on cross-cultural negotiations as well as on any other concerns that they had in terms of doing business halfway across the world. The net result after a few months was that they were able to acquire the assets of one of the foreign subsidiaries without actually buying the company. They were able to acquire the assets, and that proved to be a much more fruitful transaction for them. And then out of the other companies, they found that there was one where they didn't really need to invest, but it made a very natural channel partner for one of their key market segments. So they could do this without actually investing any capital. And they'd allocated just $10 million for these acquisitions, but by the time we were done, they actually were able to accomplish this in India for about $3 million and saving $7 million for ongoing marketing and business development efforts or future acquisitions. As it turns out, this was a couple of years ago. They have not needed to acquire any other companies, and they are working primarily through the assets of this company that they had acquired. They've hired people in India and built up their business based on that. So it's been quite a fruitful journey for them, a little bit unexpected, but that's one of the lessons I think on doing business with India is that you have to be ready to take an opportunity when it comes your way. I'm going to give you a quick overview of India and then jump into our 4 Ps of marketing as applied to India and go on from there. The couple of highlights I want to mention, since I'm based in Los Angeles, I have to start with Hollywood. If you saw the movie Great Gatsby that was produced last year, you might have noticed an Indian actor in the movie. In the movie, he played the part of Meyer Wolfsheim, and his name is not very well known in the United States, but he is India's top star. Think of him as Michael Douglas and Tom Cruise put together, if you will. And even though Twitter is available only to about, or Twitter has only about 20-30 million followers in India, Amitabh Bachchan himself has almost 9 million Indians who follow him. A little bit less than the star of The Great Gatsby, Leonardo DiCaprio, but I predict that in a couple of years, Amitabh's followers will exceed Leonardo's simply because of India's population and the growth of the internet. Hollywood continues to be a major opportunity for collaboration between Indian entertainment entities and American and Canadian entities, simply because India produces more movies than any country in the world, and television production, other entertainment-related initiatives are also running in high gear in India. Let's turn to another big business here in my backyard, which is the defense business. India is the world's largest importer of weapons and equipment. And in 2013, the United States became India's largest supplier of defense equipment. The picture on the bottom right shows the Indian Consul General visiting the factory for Boeing here in Long Beach, about 10 miles from me, because the Indian taxpayers placed an order of $4 billion of the C-17 transport aircraft, which you see pictured at the top right here. This is the C-17. India is going to have 10 of these operational in a couple of years, which will make the Indian Air Force the largest operator of the C-17 aircraft in the world, next only to the US Air Force. On the left is a picture of products by a company called Trigicon based in Michigan and Virginia, and we have taken them to India and advised them on offering products not only to the military but also to the police and security forces and the paramilitary in India, and they've been quite successful. So these are just two very diverse examples of how Western American companies in particular are succeeding in India. I was struck by this graph on the left that was published in The Economist last year, and they looked at the involvement of foreign companies in India. The graph charts their sales in India, and the numbers on the right represent their market cap and the portion of the market cap attributed to India. And you will see that companies such as Unilever and Holcim and so on have a very large percentage of their market cap being allocated to the Indian business, 44%, 15, 42% for Holcim. Suzuki, which makes motorcycles in most of the world, but is India's largest car maker, is 60%. Okay. Now, the problem and the opportunity to me is represented down here when you look at Cummins India, which is the first American company on this list. And they're all the way down at about 5% of sales and about 12% of market cap. To me, if American companies do things right over the next 10 years, we'll see a lot more U.S. companies up in the higher portion of this graph. Cummins has been very successful in India, but there's no reason why this graph shouldn't be at least half American over a period of time. On the right, I have some pictures of the GE turbines being delivered to power plants in India, and at the bottom you see women working at the Cummins factory in India. Let's move on. I really call India the $100 billion opportunity for U.S. firms. And I know that there are people from Europe and other parts of the world attending this webinar. Most of the material applies to everybody who's on the webinar. India is the fourth largest economy if you compare countries by purchasing power parity. So only the US, China, and Japan exceed India's GDP in purchasing power parity. And the beauty about India's market is that most of its population is young. More than half of all Indians are under the age of 25. So it's the youngest of these countries listed and will continue to stay young for the next 20 years, while the US and Japan will age considerably, and even China will begin to age because of its one-child policy that they've diluted only in a minor way recently. The pictures at the bottom represent some of the new India. At the left is a photograph of India's modern train system, and at the right is the Worli-Bandra Sea Link bridge in Mumbai, which cuts about 30 minutes of driving time through the very densely populated portions of India's largest city, Mumbai, which used to be called Bombay. I'm not going to read you all the points on this slide. The slides will be available later for you. So why should you be thinking about India right now in 2014? There's a number of reasons. Firstly, there is the political alignment between the two countries that has become much stronger over the last 3 presidents than it was really since India was formed. India-US relations were at a low when President Nixon was in office. And since President Clinton's time, things have improved dramatically. President George W. Bush continued that improvement, and I was fortunate enough to be on the executive trade mission to India with President Obama a few years ago when he became the first US president to visit India during his first term. India's GDP continues to grow at somewhere between 5 to 8%, and the country receives a substantial amount of foreign direct investment, although I contend that FDI is not what is driving growth in India, and that's something we can discuss if somebody has a question. The one factor that people don't notice about India compared to the other so-called BRIC countries, meaning Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which are often lumped together, India is the most America-friendly country of those 4. The average Indian citizen, the average Indian executive, and the average Indian government official has a much more positive view of the United States than the citizens of China or Russia and even of Brazil. And this is something that American companies can particularly leverage in getting to success. Now, one of the questions that came in on email was, which are the top sectors in, for doing business in India? Where do we see the most potential? And that's a tough one, really, because in a sense, the growth in India is secular across virtually all industries. And I've listed 10 sectors that we think will do particularly well. They are not ranked, by the way, so they're all important, and some of them are huge opportunities, such as energy and healthcare. We do at Amritt, we do a lot of work in consumer products and in medical devices. I'm not going to address those specifically in this webinar, but I'm happy to take questions about those. But I would say really these 10 sectors and pretty much anything else that you might be active in, it would make a good market in India. India does have some limitations. So if you want to own a television station in India, you can do that, but that's also the case in the US. You might remember that Rupert Murdoch had to become a US citizen to be able to list News Corp on the New York Stock Exchange. So there are some limitations, but they're quite limited now. Over the last 10 years, India has liberalized in most sectors. There are still some that need special dispensation, and some that are prohibited for foreign companies. I will take questions based on specific requests from people related to these sectors rather than talk about each of them individually. Let's see if we can conduct one more poll at this time. So I'd like to know how far along you are in doing business in India, whether you're considering the idea, whether you have some sales, whether the sales have become very important, or whether you already have a subsidiary or a manufacturing location. Okay, the votes continue to trickle in. So folks, you should be experts at this by now. I am going to close the polls and share the results. On your screen, you should see that 44% of you said you're just considering the idea, and another 24% said that you have limited sales, whereas you've got about 12% who say that you already have an India subsidiary. The composition of these answers seems to indicate that we've had a lot of new people join in between the first poll and now, and that's fine. I will try and address the rest of the webinar essentially to novices in India. I would encourage people who already have a subsidiary or factory in India to send me very specific and detailed questions, which I'll be happy to take on towards the end, as well as by email or phone later if we don't get to them during the course of the webinar. So we all know, if you went to business school, about the 4 P's of marketing: place, product, price, and promotion. Place meaning distribution, and promotion could mean advertising as well. So I'm going to step through these as they apply to India. I cover this in some more depth in my book, which was published a few years ago by Warner Hachette, but I want to cover a couple of the high points relating to this. And let me start with an issue that we also got a question relating to this, I think, from Kathy. So Kathy, this next few slides are for you. I would say about half the time when we are approached by a new prospective client on the phone or by email, the 3 magic words that we hear from them within the first 90 seconds is, help me select a distributor. People call us, they know that we are the experts on India, and they come to us with this question. So my question for you in the audience is, how many potential mistakes are embedded in this statement or in this question? A lot of the work that we do at Amritt is not just answering your questions, but helping you ask the right question. And it is my contention that in these 3 words, there are 3 potential errors. And I will step through them one at a time. So first of all, people come to us looking for a distributor. And sure, for many of you, a distributor is the right solution. But I'm here to tell you that for many of you, a distributor is probably not the right solution. Okay. I've got a couple of examples of this from very diverse industries. Pratt & Whitney, which is a subsidiary of United Technologies, makes engines that go into civilian and to some extent in military aircraft as well. Well, they didn't appoint a distributor to succeed in India. They actually have a Connecticut-based salesman who travels to India as much as once or twice a month. They felt that the knowledge that is needed to sell something as complex as an engine to an airline who's buying a plane from Boeing or Airbus or Embraer, that you really need somebody who is embedded inside the corporate headquarters and understands the company extremely well and is available at a moment's notice to go out to make a sales call or a follow-up call to a top executive at an Indian airline. And that model seems to have worked well for them. At the other extreme is a group dating service that started in Manhattan. They're kind of like Match.com, other than they cater to couples who want to go as a group on a date, 4 or 5 or 6 couples together, going to dinner or whatever. And they found that while they were based in Manhattan, the most active percentage of their audience was coming from Mumbai and Delhi and other Indian cities. So they took the unusual step of taking the company lock, stock, and barrel and moving to Mumbai to run this essentially as an Indian company with American investors run by American entrepreneurs out of Mumbai. And the last I heard is that they are doing pretty well. To give you another example, on a business-to-business side, we had a client that made a particular kind of seal that goes into cars and motorcycles. And our final advice to them was to hire one single salesperson located in a major automotive city in India, Chennai. And the salesperson's job was to go and get the seal specified into a handful of key OEM customers. This proved to be a much better model for them than appointing a distributor or trying to run the sales from the US or doing anything else. They don't need to manufacture in India. Their material is readily shipped from the US and Asian factories. And for the last 5 years, they have succeeded with just one salesperson. I hear that they may be ready now to appoint a second salesperson. And that's really the extent of their presence in India. Now, some companies go much further than that. And our client Paramount Farms, who we worked with for about 6 years, actually took it upon themselves right from day one that they wanted to set up a business unit in India, a small subsidiary, and actually do the roasting and packing and some of the marketing and sales right on the ground in India. So all these are approaches that are alternate approaches to distribution and can work well and have worked well for many of our clients. Finally, I want to mention very briefly that you could, of course, license your technology or your brand to an Indian company and simply earn the revenue from the royalties without having to set up an India presence. There was a chip company for which we found that this kind of approach was the best solution, where they really didn't need to invest effort in understanding the Indian market. They found a partner who could offer the technology and find their own methods to market it. So these are all approaches that are perfectly viable and alternative to selecting a distributor. I have an example here I'll run through very briefly. This company makes currency acceptors that can recognize dollar bills and coins, and they had not had any success in using a large national distributor in India. So we did a number of engagements for them, and then finally they hired us to fix this problem. Our final recommendation was that they really needed a three-pronged approach. They sold their currency acceptors into the suburban train and metro commuter train market. And for that, we felt that they really needed a direct approach, and they took one of their European salespeople to be able to handle that on a direct basis. We then appointed 2 small distributors to take care of the vertical markets, such as the candy machines and other point-of-sale machines that sell magazines and newspapers and such like. And it was much better to have a specialized distributor for whom this segment was large enough and valuable enough relative to their sales that they would go and spend the effort to train their salespeople and go out and target the value-added resellers and the people who made these types of machines. And finally, we appointed one company to take care of the occasional end user or random order that might come in from somebody who might just need 2 or 3 of these machines, of these currency recognition devices. And these people were not really meant to generate any demand. They were just meant to be available to supply product from inventory. And this approach has worked well for them. So again, we did choose distributors, but a very different approach than the client had originally thought about. Let's look at the next word, select a distributor. Okay, that for many people they say, hey, we have one distributor in Greece, we have another distributor in Thailand. Give me a distributor for India. But the problem is, for most of you, recognize that India has a population that exceeds that of Europe. And it's a country where people speak 23 different languages. It's also a country where the logistics of product flow from one end of the country to another is not as smooth as you would see in most other countries. Distributors in India typically handle the physical movement of goods very often through the last mile to the retail point or to the distribution point. So as an extreme example, Unilever, which is India's largest consumer product company, I want to share with you that they have almost 5,000 distributors. So the chances that a single distributor will work for you in India are unlikely. We have had a few cases where we've recommended just one distributor for an American client, but chances are we'll be looking for a small group of distributors and perhaps some other kinds of channels for you. Finally, I take issue with the word select, because people come to me and say, hey, I get more inquiries from India than any other country. And so all you have to do, my friends at Amritt, is help me choose which is the best company from all the inquiries we've received. But the challenge there is that people who are hungry enough to inquire from you in a growing economy are usually not the ones who are the appropriate partners for you. So we look at those companies, but we most often find a better solution by canvassing the more successful and hardworking companies that may not really be focused on finding new partners, but might be the logical choice for you. So when you want to select a distributor, be open to the idea that there may be issues with each of those aspects. So that's enough said about place. Let's move on very quickly to product. And let me see if there's any questions. Supriya, before we go there, are there questions relating to distribution that I can answer?
Let me just have a look quickly. They were mostly more in a general factor, so we can address them, later on. You can carry on right now.
All right. I see something from Kathy that maybe I can take up right now. Biggest issue is finding an interesting distributor who's willing to purchase, warehouse, market, and distribute to the appropriate classes of trade. Usually a company wishes to add products to their existing line of products. We manufacture a personal lubricant and are very interested in continued expansion outside the US, and we have regulatory issues. I think I've covered most of Kathy's concerns in the general discussion. Kathy, if there are particular issues relating to your industry or your product segment, I'd rather take them one-on-one because there may be specific issues relating to a product such as a personal lubricant, which which might be very different due to cultural factors in India. We would think that there's a good market for that, but you may need to approach it a little differently in India than other countries. So let me move on and talk about the product. We were hired by a company that had been in India for 2 years, and they weren't really meeting their objectives for sales. As we looked at their offering, we found that they had priced it correctly. They had very limited distribution, but that was by intent. And their promotion activities were focused primarily on the point of sale, which is what we would have recommended for a company with a limited budget as they had. But sales were still far below their projection. And we felt that the issue was really the product itself. I can't reveal a lot of detail, but we ended up conducting focus group studies in about 4 Indian cities, which confirmed our initial suspicion that there was something about the product that needed to change. It turned out, fortunately, that the change was very simple. One of the ingredients that they were adding to the product was not appreciated by the Indian consumer. And so all we had to do was recommend to them that they remove that ingredient. And we had, in fact, asked them to send us some special versions of the product without that ingredient because of this inkling that we had. And in a small subset of our focus groups studies, we tested out the modified product and found it to be far more successful. So the beauty was that not only did we help them increase sales, but by removing this ingredient and keeping the price at the same point, they actually saved about 5 or 6% in the cost of the product and improved their gross margin while increasing their sales. it turned out to be a happy experience for them. Tweaking the product is something that many companies, both in business and consumer and government sector, have found it useful to do in India. And this is a topic on which I could actually probably spend the entire webinar. Here's a couple of other examples. Medtronic, which is a medical device company, the largest medical device company, standalone medical device company in the world, and they sell stents and pacemakers and other products. In India, they decided to offer products such as stents and pacemakers to patients, to end patients on a credit plan, pay as you go, pay over a 3 or 4 year period kind of thing, which is the first country, I believe, that they had done that as a direct provider of medical devices. And again, this is dictated by some of the economics of the healthcare business in India. I know that we have some questions on the medical device business, which I will get to later on. But the idea here was to modify the product offering to be able to meet the needs in India. If you go to India, you'll find lots of Subway sandwich stores, but you'll also now find some Dunkin' Donuts, which is relatively new. And the franchisee for Dunkin' Donuts in India recommended, even before they started, that donuts by themselves may not be such a big seller. So in India and India alone, the company is branded as Dunkin' Donuts and more, and they offer a number of products outside your traditional donuts and coffee line. It's too early to say how well it's working, but I imagine that this will be a key part of their success. And while I'm talking about franchise restaurants, another little surprising note to many of you, McDonald's is very successful in India. And they have a vegetarian line that they serve at all the McDonald's stores. But last year, they took the unusual step of opening 2 stores in India that are exclusively vegetarian, where you cannot buy chicken, lamb. Of course, you can't buy beef at any McDonald's in India, so there's no Big Macs. But these 2 stores have nothing but vegetarian products. And again, they've taken all of the other aspects of McDonald's and applied them to be quite successful. Let's move on to promotion or advertising. And again, I have a picture of India's top movie star, Amitabh Bachchan, but in a very unusual kind of role here. One of India's upcoming concrete companies is called Binani Cement, and Amitabh Bachchan in India is often referred to as the Big B. And the folks at Binani thought, wouldn't it be clever to pay Amitabh Bachchan to become their so-called brand ambassador? And so all over India now you will see these billboards and print ads where a top star is promoting boring industrial products such as concrete or cement. Can you imagine Leonardo or Tom Cruise on an ad like that in the US? Probably not. And the point that I'm making is that while advertising is quite sophisticated in India, it works in a different manner. And as you enter India, you need to be aware of this, that you can't necessarily use the same approach that might have served you well in most of the world. There are world-class agencies in India. And the nice thing compared to the US is that in India, because of rising literacy and a growing economy, all forms of media are growing. So you can advertise in newspapers, which are increasing in circulation, print magazines, radio, commercial radio, private radio is relatively new in India. Television channels are quite mature, both broadcast as well as cable and direct-to-home. And the internet is still a fledgling medium in India, but is becoming larger and larger. I think Facebook says India is their second market worldwide now, and we expect a lot more growth. I've got a couple of pictures here of some creative ads. The one on the right is a business-to-business ad from the Hindu newspaper, and it's one that they want the reader to think a little bit. In India, many of the tabloids have a so-called page 3 where they'll have gossip and risque pictures of bikini-clad models and so on. So there's a whole sub-reference to a culture, a page 3 culture, which essentially talks about a very shallow form of reporting. So the Hindu wants to emphasize that they also have a page 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's a direct dig at one of their competitors called Midday. And then the slogan at the bottom is a dig at the Times of India, which is India's largest circulating newspaper. They're saying stay ahead of the time. This kind of thought-provoking or humorous advertising is not uncommon in India. At the bottom left is an ad that just appeared recently, shortly after Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula. There were reports, half joking reports in Indian media that Russia wants Alaska back, and this is again more to illustrate how much America is in the news in India. That India's largest butter company, Amul, put up these billboards all across the country, making a little bit of a dig about forget Alaska, get a Muska. And a Muska is an Indian term which I won't explain right now. But basically, they expect their audience to be aware of world events, and they use that to humorous and sometimes political purposes to be able to drive home a point. Political advertising, religious advertising in India, I mean, using politics and religion in business advertising in India is not considered inappropriate, and you'll see a lot of that going on in many situations in India. Alrighty, let's talk a little bit about price. And many people will tell you that the Indian consumer or the Indian buyer can't afford X or Y. And our experience has been quite the opposite. You really have to price the product in India in a manner that is appropriate for the Indian buyer, whether it's a business, a government, or a consumer. If you can justify to them why they should be paying that price, Indian consumers tend to be very brand loyal, and they tend to, they will tend to want to spend money on foreign products. That's usually not a problem. I'm illustrating here with the example of the Ford Motor Company, which designed a car in India for India and has then subsequently sold it to almost 40 countries in Latin America, Africa, and across Asia. I think the latest numbers are close to 500,000 cars sold, and this was made possible by a design that was specific to India. You are not likely to see the FIGO being offered here in the US, but it is sold in Mexico as the Icon, I-K-O-N. The Ford Icon in Mexico is actually a Ford FIGO made in Chennai, India, with just a different label on it. Even in the business-to-business sector, we find that the way that you can sell your product into India sometimes is by removing the features that the Indian buyer does not care about, and perhaps adding those that they do care about, such as after-sales service, such as simplicity of use, whatever is specific to your market segment, and then you price it appropriately for India, and you'll find that you can have tremendous success. Okay. I'd like to find out what is your current big worry in thinking about India. And I realized that I couldn't cover all the possible worries. So if your worry is something other than the first 3 or 4 listed, please send me an indication through the question box. I'm really curious to see what else might keep you up at night.
Gunjan, there was a question with regards to a specific slide. Would you like to take that now?
Please.
Cecilia asked, I think regarding the food client example that you had in the product segment, should we question whether they have the right marketing team? Why would this require a consulting firm to correct?
No, that's a good question. Often what happens in this particular case, and often what happens is that the marketing team is dealing with a number of countries. In this particular case, the team based in the West was dealing with most of Southeast Asia, the Middle East, India, as well as some other countries which I can't name. And they assumed, for whatever reason, that the taste habits would be similar across the South Asian region. In particular, I think Thailand and Malaysia they had seen quite a bit of success with their standard product. And so it was reasonable for them to assume, based in the West, that, hey, why is India so different? They really weren't focused on the product. They really came to us asking, hey, do we need to increase our advertising budget? Do we need to advertise in local languages? And so they'd given this some thought, and their worries were really focused on the apparent differences in India as far as the size and as far as the multiple languages. And our analysis showed that in this particular case that most of the people who were going to buy their product were quite comfortable with the English language. In fact, since India has 28 languages, English often serves as the common language. So that really wasn't in the product labeling and language wasn't an issue. And this is something that I think, sure, if they had 20 people in marketing and sales sitting in India, they would ultimately have figured this out. But the fact that they had a small team which was remote, and they were really getting feedback from distributors, essentially saying, "Please increase your advertising." It's natural for us as consultants who solve the same kinds of problems for multiple companies to be able to offer that value. Now, could they have done this on their own? Absolutely. I mean, I tell all our clients that there's no magic to what we at Amritt or any India expert consultant would do. It's just that working with an expert consultant, you will make fewer mistakes and you will make them faster so that you can correct on them faster and reduce your headache and reduce your risk. I hope that answers your question, Cecilia. If you have anything more, I'm happy to take it in follow-up.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. So do we still have the poll open, Supriya?
Yes.
Okay. So let me close the poll. Most of you are concerned. Oh, let me share it. Most of you are concerned about finding the right business partner, and the plurality of you are concerned about charging a price that Indians can afford. I think I've addressed both of those issues. I'm surprised that not many of you are concerned about reaching the right potential customers. We often find that that's a significant issue in our consulting, particularly around business-to-business customers, because of the nature of the Indian market is different. So if I were to look at each of your business plans of the people who have answered this poll, I wouldn't be surprised if for some of you, we may find that with Amritt's work that that's an important factor as well. And I'm very pleased to see that none of you are worried about traveling to India and staying there and so on. 3 or 4 years ago, I would say that many people used to be concerned about that. Now, India's airports and hotels have gotten a little bit better, but I think more importantly, India has become more familiar to most Western executives, and that's a good sign. The world's largest democracy should be working more closely with the world's oldest democracy. And so that, to me, the fact that there's a 0% on the difficulty of travel question is a wonderful thing. Let me hide this and move into the final leg of the webinar. I'm going to see if I can roll through real quick here. Don't assume that Indians speak English, and particularly don't assume that they think American. Don't assume that just because you have somebody with an Indian-sounding name on your staff, that they are the best person to deal with your Indian issues. Sometimes they might be, but India has changed considerably since many of them left India. And it's also a very open society. So someone who has never been to India, someone who may have been born in Texas and grown up in Oklahoma, can go to India and become successful provided they are humble and they listen and they react to what they learn in India. In writing my book, I interviewed over 100 American executives living in India, and I found many who knew absolutely nothing about India a few months before they went there and had been extremely successful. I also found many who were unhappy and wanted to get back quickly, often because they hadn't really planned with what would happen with their spouse or their family and so on. But I'd say that India is largely an open society, very different in this aspect from other large East Asian countries such as Korea or Japan or China, where it's much harder even for someone with an open mind to be able to be accepted. Finally, don't wait. Time to enter India is now. If you wait, you will find that larger and more nimble competitors will be ahead of you. The key to success really lies in preparation and in looking at India as a fresh new market. There are no quick bucks to be made in India. In most cases, you require a medium-term investment. So let's take the questions that we have. We got some that came in by email. And Supriya, unless you have something pressing on your list, I can start with the email questions, whatever you say.
We do have a lot of questions come in, Gunjan. So either way that you want me to proceed, I'm happy to do that.
Why don't we start with the ones that came in live?
Okay, sounds good. Elsie has asked, as in China, are there any potential liability downsides when acquiring business assets in India?
Potential liabilities in India. So first, let me just set to rest the, when we set up a company in the U.S., we are always worried about legal liability. What happens if one of my consumers or customers sues me because the product doesn't work as they wanted it to work? That issue in India is fairly small. It's there, obviously, it's there in every country, and there are consumer courts and mechanisms set up, but the amount of money you spend on something like that or the amount of liability insurance you need to buy is fairly small. But I think our question has to do more with the liabilities in terms of acquiring something and being surprised by assets that aren't worth as much or by other issues. Yeah, absolutely. Whenever you're acquiring a company that is halfway across the world, you want to be very cautious about what you are buying, and you want to conduct due diligence that is guided by people who understand that culture. The biggest problems we find is when due diligence on an acquisition has been conducted exclusively by people who are not resident to that culture. If you send your entire team, it doesn't matter whether they're coming from your own company or from from one of the big four firms or anybody else. If they're all coming from overseas, the lens at which they look at the Indian assets will be the inappropriate lens. So they're liable to get concerned about a lot of things that may not be so important, but more significant. They're liable to miss things that are staring at them in the face, but they don't become apparent, to somebody who's not steeped in that culture. We depend quite a bit on our professional and social networks to be able to find the reputation of managers, to be able to get the the buzz on the company through the trade, through the competition, through other sources. And we find that information is as valuable as the paper reports and financial data that they provide you. So yes, this is something that can you repeat the question once more, Supriya, to be sure I addressed it?
Sure. As in China, are there any potential liability downsides when acquiring business assets in India?
Yeah, I think I covered the high points. One other difference, I think, in China, very often, any company or assets that you're buying will ultimately have some degree of ownership by some functionary in the Communist Party or some local or state government. And often that is not immediately visible to you. That's not the case in India. Most companies that you would be considering, or most assets, would be privately owned, and the the state or the municipality would have a very minimal role. There are state-owned companies, and they do sometimes divest, but typically it's through public offerings and very large divestitures. So most of what you might be considering, at least, would be acquisitions from private entities, and at least you'll know who the owners are. Now, land ownership is a whole separate subject. I'm not going to address that in today's webinar, but there you have to be especially careful. What else do you have, Supriya?
So Shaw is asking, it's kind of a two-part question. Are there any specific states that are better suited to entry than others? And his second part of the question is, what are the pain points of rural India?
Yeah, so India has 28, soon to be 29 states, and it's a very diverse country. So if you look at the states in the Northeast, they are heavily forested and very remote from Delhi. You look at the northwestern states such as Rajasthan, and it's one of the large desert states. You look at Gujarat, which is probably one of the showcases of industrial and balanced development in India. You look at South India with the automotive and telecom business in Tamil Nadu, and the IT and aviation business in Karnataka, where Bangalore is located. India is a very, very diverse country. There's opportunity all over the place. I would say that out of India's 28 states, if you are going in and you're selling a product where geography within India matters, as opposed to, say, an aircraft engine or something like that, out of the 28 or 29 states, we would probably focus our attention on no more than the top 8 or so. And within those 8, we would then help you decide whether where to locate your team, and how to operate. So, and some of these states might be Maharashtra, the four southern states of Andhra, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. We might look at Delhi and the surrounding areas. We might look at Rajasthan and Gujarat, and Punjab and Haryana, depending on your products. There are other states, if you're in the mining business, you obviously have to go where the resources are, and there's some negative factors related to those states, but obviously you're not going to move the iron ore or the aluminum ore from one state to another. Some of the states that unfortunately don't make a great opportunity for Western companies are the so-called seven sisters, the seven states in the East. They're a beautiful part of the country. They're a little bit remote and hard to get to, and unless you're in the tea business, chances are that you don't want to be in one of those states. I'm hoping that that will change over the years because it's a part of the country that needs development and has great things to offer, but I can't in good conscience recommend to our clients that they go there at this time. The pain points is the subject of a whole webinar by itself. Sure, I covered some of the issues relating to the difficulties of going to India. I think the biggest pain point that I see with people who become our clients is that they come with the wrong expectation about India. They think India is China 2.0. They've typically entered China before they've gone to India, and they think that what they learned in China they can apply to India. And nothing could be further from the truth. India is an open society. India is a democracy. India has a valid, vibrant stock market that's not fixed. India does not censor Google largely. You can operate Facebook in India. There's no limit to the number of Western movies you can see in India. So everybody in India, for good or for bad, knows who Britney Spears and Miley Cyrus and Lady Gaga are. It's a little bit of a different environment, I think, than China. And I think it's important to fully appreciate that. But India is not like the United States. That's the other mistake people make. When they say, oh, okay, if they understand Lady Gaga, then I can sell them my product. Well, not so. India is steeped in a very ancient culture, and Indians may look Western on the surface, but inside they really follow the Indian way of thinking, decision-making, and negotiating, and you need to be able to understand that. It's a complex answer I'm giving you, Shaw, but this is the reality. Okay, what else do we have?
Great, thanks, Gunjan. We have a question from Nick on brand loyalty in India. What tactics can be used to establish loyalty above price as the primary driver there?
Oh, we're getting great questions today.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example of Whirlpool, okay, an American company that has had tremendous success in India in an area where GE failed, in terms of making large appliances. GE backed out of that market. But Whirlpool, by taking great pains to understand the nature of the Indian market and the nature of decision making for large appliances in India, has become extremely successful against Korean and Chinese competition. So for example, when they wanted to sell washing machines in India, they knew that they were going to be higher priced than the Chinese and Korean competition. They also understood, they took the time to understand that in India, the average woman who wants to buy a washer or who has the budget to buy a clothes washer also probably employs a servant in her household, as is common in India, to do the clothes washing. And the average housewife in India believes that hand washing is superior to machine washing because you can really focus your attention on the grimy parts of the clothing. And India is a dusty country, so that's kind of important. So their whole branding, imaging, and advertising really focused not on how washing machine might save your hands or make it more, free up the time for the housewife, because those issues didn't really matter to her. It focused the attention on how the agitator inside the Whirlpool washer is so much like hand washing. Okay. Now this is a curious message to most Americans, but this is the one that was very carefully thought out and crafted, and it resonated with the Indian buyers. And so they really went with the washing machine because they wanted to be modern and they wanted something that would be almost as good as hand washing. And the other conveniences become secondary to that. And through this and many other means, Whirlpool has continued to maintain a loyal customer base, even though their product is not the least expensive. And the message I'm giving for you really is that you want to pick out what the Indian customer, whether it's a business customer, a government customer, or a consumer, what is it that they value, and attach something related to that value in the design, marketing, and distribution of your product. Let me take some questions that came in by email because I promised people that I would address them. So let me just look at those here.
And I just want to point out to everyone that if we are not able to answer your questions today, Gunjan will email you, with an answer to your questions, because we do have a large number of questions that have come in. So thank you for being for a great audience, I guess.
Okay, and we are at the limit, the 1 hour limit. I will stay on answering questions. If some of you need to drop off, I totally understand. So Chris had a question about what are the main barriers to enter the India market. I think I've addressed those at a broad level. If there are specific barriers that you're concerned about, Chris, please put them in the question box and we'll deal with it. Also had a question about creating a banking relationship which works. So I assume, Chris, that you already have a banking relationship and you're not happy with it. And I assume this has to do with international transactions in a banking relationship rather than just within India. So the history of Indian banking is that back in the late 1960s, the Prime Minister at that time nationalized the top 14 banks, and the service at all of them essentially went downhill overnight because they became instruments of the state and of the political parties in power. That changed dramatically after 1991 when India liberalized and banks such as the ICICI Bank and HDFC became very popular because they began opening as late as 8 or 9 o'clock, offering home delivery of cash beyond ATM machines, offering hours sometimes on the weekend, and a much more robust commercial banking service as well. This, of course, prompted the 14 nationalized banks to respond, and over the years they have become far more digital, far more online. In India, it is routine now for any bank to be able to perform an online transaction where money moves from person X to person Y within minutes rather than hours or days. And I can't get Chase Bank in the US to do that for my personal account. So in a sense, India's electronic system has leapfrogged some of the things that we see in the US. The international transactions in India are still heavily regulated, and the Indian government wants to know how and why you are moving money and so on. It is relatively freely convertible, but there's always questions to be answered. So I would really probe with you whether the issues are around meeting some of those regulations, which will be about the same for any bank, or around the responsiveness of your bank to your needs. And that's something that I can take on a one-to-one basis if you want. But there are significant differences between the way various banks operate. Often an American company will say, oh, let me just work with a US bank. And sometimes that works, but US banks have very limited branches in India. And so there is a downside to that, depending on the nature of your business and how widely it is distributed. For one of our clients, we recommended very strongly that they open an account at the nearest branch to the key wholesale market where they needed to operate. I said, I don't care who is the bank that operates there, but you need to be within walking distance of the merchants because of the nature of the business. It took me 6 months to convince their CFO that that was a good idea, but the moment they did that, they found that the amount of business that they were receiving almost doubled over the next 90 days. Now, this was very specific to their situation. I'm not saying this is the right solution for you, Chris, but these are the kinds of factors that I would look at. I have a question from Robbie about regulatory approvals. He's talking about CE Mark and FDA, so I assume this is a medical device company. And medical device companies from the US are extremely successful in India. In fact, 2/3 of the sales of medical devices in India are performed by foreign companies, particularly American companies. India does have a regulatory body that controls the issue of medical devices, but it's until very recently it's been part of the same unit that controls the release of pharmaceuticals. With the suggestion of medical device companies and foreign companies in particular, India is in the process of setting up a separate and specific regulatory agency that will deal with medical devices. The laws have been passed in Parliament, but the regulations may take a couple of years to come through. So you still need to go through the whole process. And if your device is already approved by the US FDA or by the European CE, then the process becomes a little bit simpler because they will accept most of that documentation. They still require you to file a local application and go through approvals. But an Indian company designing a product for India typically won't have an FDA or CE approval. So you as a foreign company typically have an advantage over local competition. And this is one of the perverse things about Indian regulations, which we think will change over time as people recognize the innovative power of Indian engineers who are now getting into the medical device business. But for now, I think you would follow the route of registering through this through the agency that deals with the drugs. Robbie also had a question about reimbursement by hospitals, and that depends on whether your product is approved by hospitals. Government hospitals can be divided into the railways and the military hospitals and the state hospitals. And then in the private sector, there are for-profit chains as well as non-profits. Apollo and Fortis are some of the big chains, and you'd of course have to get approved by each of them to be registered and certified. It's becoming far more possible to consider these kinds of approaches than it would have been even 3 or 4 years ago, where almost all the payments for reimbursement of devices were through a direct patient payment. That is starting to change with the rise of insurance and some of the corporate plans. I think I've taken care of the questions that came in by email. So Supriya, we can stay on for another few minutes. It looks like there's still a lot of people online.
Yes.
So I don't want to shortchange them. Yeah, tell me what else we have.
So there was one actually right in line. You were talking about the health care, medical device segment. So Girish had a question. It's a wide question though. So if you want to address it with him later, but I wanted to bring it up, which is what are the key factors to bear in mind when a Western company partners with distributors in a specialized capital medical device market segment in India?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work in medical devices, so this is something I can talk about. First of all, you have to be clear of your expectations from the distributor. Are you looking for the distributor simply to ship the product from inventory to the consumer? I mean, to the hospital or the clinic or the patient, whatever is appropriate? Or are you looking for them to create demand? The latter is much harder for most distributors in India to do. And some can, but sometimes it makes sense to have some of your own effort supplementing that of the distributor. Then you have to look at what's the footprint you want the distributor to achieve. Is this primarily at the clinic level? Are they selling to large hospitals? They may say that they understand how to sell to an Apollo or a Fortis, but very few people do. And if they say, well, there's an Apollo hospital in my town, and my brother-in-law knows somebody who knows somebody, and at the corporate location of Apollo, chances are that that's not going to work. The large chains have their own buying decision processes, and you need to be in line with them. And if you're selling to the state or the government agencies, typically they will buy from the L1 bidder through the lowest cost bidder through a tender process, and that's a whole new game in itself. You want to be sure that your distributor has that kind of experience dealing with foreign companies entering India doing so. And generally speaking, that's something that you will need to supplement in terms of making the ultimate buyers aware of the special features of your product. Otherwise, the RFPs may end up getting written in a manner where you'll never be the L1. So that's something you have to keep in mind. As I said, American companies are quite successful in India, but it's after they've taken the time to understand all of these specific parameters to India. Yes, Supriya, anything else?
Yeah. So Anthony is asking a question about the general feeling of safety of foreigners traveling throughout India.
Yeah. So what I tell business visitors that if you follow our general advice and guidance, there are two big risks in India, and they don't have to do with personal safety as such. in the manner that somebody will rob you or hurt you. They really have to do with eating and drinking the right food and water so that you don't get an upset stomach, and staying out of the roadways in India so you don't get run over by a motorcycle, car, or truck. Indian traffic rules are very different, and the pedestrians do not have the right of way. So those are the two main risks that I think you need to watch for in terms of personal safety. India is a relatively safe place. We have special guidance for women traveling to India, and we've taken women executives of all ages and to India and across the country in a perfectly reasonable and safe manner. But there are some guidance factors that we have relating to, dressing appropriately and not being at the wrong place at the wrong time and so on. But it's in a business travel sense, it's really not an issue at all, provided you follow some of our simple guidelines.
Great. He also has a follow-up question about the cultural acceptance with regards to corruption and how pervasive is the expectation of some supplementary payment for governmental approvals.
Okay, so first let me say that as a U.S. company, you and we as Amritt are subject to the provisions of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which prohibits most forms of payment that are not transparent and clear. So we would never advise you to do anything that puts you at risk of violating or seen to be violating the FCPA. That being said, corruption is rampant in India, and you will find that in many cases there are contracts that won't be won by American companies. European and Russian and other companies have far looser standards on these matters, and they will win some of that business. Our advice to our clients is to stay away from that kind of business. But there are plenty of government contracts being awarded to American companies who are 100% compliant with FCPA and ITAR, which is the International Trafficking in Arms regulations, which are even more intrusive and restrictive. So it's absolutely possible to make an honest buck in India. In fact, to some extent, it is an advantage for American companies because Indians know that American companies cannot go in that direction. So after you get asked once or twice, when you make it plain that this is not something you're willing to consider, the discussions become a lot cleaner and a lot less uncomfortable because people realize that this is not something that you are willing to entertain. So that's our general advice to most companies. There's some things at the edges which I can get into on a one-on-one basis in terms of the difference between tipping and bribing, and certainly tipping is a part of many cultures that have been influenced by the British. It's very different from bribing, and you wouldn't want to confuse one for the other.
Great. Thanks, Gunjan. How much time do you have, Gunjan? We still have a few questions, but if you want to take them offline and respond via email, that's fine as well.
I see more than 24 people online, so let me do justice to them. I'm going strong. Let's take at least two more questions.
Okay. So Elsie had a question or is inquiring about any duties, tax issues with regards to imported products in India.
So there are many layers of taxes and duties in India. Some of them are subjected only to products that enter Indian shores that are manufactured overseas, and others are applied to all products manufactured in India. So you go through those layers of duties and taxes. The specific answer depends on two things. Number one, what your product is, and number two, how it will be used in India, meaning who the end customer or what kind of end customer it will be going to. So as part of our consulting, we help our clients figure out the various components. And just as an example to illustrate the thing that I mentioned earlier about the application, so if you have a piece of lab equipment that's going to be used in a hospital, the duty may be lower than if the same piece of equipment was going to be used in a manufacturing facility. Okay? And there are cases where you have imaging devices that have dual purposes. So you might find that the import duty or the final price is a little bit different based on those factors. The other thing that you have to be aware of in India is that if you move product from one state to another, sometimes there is a local sales tax or a state sales tax implication. There is a move afoot over the last few years to get rid of these state-based taxes and come up with a national goods and services tax. It's still under discussion, and I'm hopeful that after these elections, whichever government comes into power will take up this issue and try to get the thorny issues around it resolved so that the taxation becomes a little simpler.
Great. Thanks,
All right.
Gunjan.
One last question.
Yeah, we'll take one last question. And for anyone who we have not answered, again, Gunjan will respond to you via email. So thank you for your participation. We have sort of a similar question from two people. Sujata and Jeanette both would like to know more about intellectual property issues in India, and how do you handle clients or partners who might modify the products and resell it as another product. So more in the lines of intellectual property issues in India.
Okay, great question. I didn't address that at all in my prepared remarks here. So India became a founding member of the World Trade Organization in 1996, and as part of that commitment, India resolved to bring its IP laws in compliance with the so-called TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property practices. That process is substantially complete by now. And for the most part, in most industrial sectors, the laws in India are very consistent with what you might expect in Western countries. There are some sectors where there are issues, entertainment, music, movies, and so on, and to some extent software. There are some legal disputes around pharma, which I won't get into because they are again very specialized, and there's reasonable arguments on both sides of that. But outside of those areas, the laws and practices in India are very clear, and they generally favor the IP owners. The practical matter in India is that if you have a dispute of any kind, whether it's contractual or over IP or anything, the legal system in India runs extremely slowly. And so the enforcement of those laws and extracting a price for whatever went wrong can take you a long time. And so often our guidance to American and Western companies in dealing with India revolves around how do you protect yourself when the legal system, should you ever need it, is so painstakingly slow. And so we would have specific advice in protecting your IP and perhaps layering the protection so that in case something goes awry, that your losses are mitigated. The Indian courts have been quite different from Chinese courts in these matters. In my book, I talk about how News Corp took India's, some of India's laws all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court of India sided with News Corp against local players more than once. There was a case with somebody had produced a magazine that looked visually like Time magazine, and the U.S. publication was awarded not only a victory but punitive damages against the publisher of this Indian magazine. Indian courts in general, when they do reach that decision point, I think have been generally fair and equitable. So it's quite unlike China, where you find often that the IP violators are entities owned or operated by units of the Chinese government, and Chinese courts will very rarely take a decision against their own companies. That's generally not the case in India. But yes, vigilance is still called for, and it's primarily because of the slowness of enforcement and the fact that violators know that the enforcement system is so slow.
Great. Thank you so much, Gunjan. Thank you for staying on and answering as many questions as we could get to. Appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar today. We hope it was informative for you. If you have any additional questions, please do email us at usa@amritt.com. Again, that's usa@amritt.com. Please make sure as you exit the webinar that you complete a brief survey we would like you to complete, and we would really appreciate your feedback. If you have any friends or colleagues who you think might benefit from a similar webinar, please do have them register on our website, www.amritt.com, and we will notify them of any upcoming webinars. Once again, if there were any questions that were left unanswered, Gunjan will try and get back to you via email. We appreciate your participation. It was a very interactive audience, which always makes the webinar great for us. So once again, thank you so much for attending today, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye.